How's everyone doing this week?
Getting colder.
Winter is coming.
Yeah.
Got coworkers up in Minnesota, St. Paul kind of area. And he was like, yeah, it got up to 7 today. And he was saying on a meeting with a bunch of people from the UK, and they're like, 7, that's balmy. And it's like, no, American units, Fahrenheit. Suddenly, everybody in the EU was trying to do complex math in the head. And I'm just like, just think around 15 below, give or take. I'm like, oh, that's cold.
It's warm here for some reason. It's been like in the 40s. It's very bizarre. I live in Maine. It's not supposed to be in the 40s right now in Maine.
Yeah, we're unseasonably warm right now on the East Coast. We'll get our fair share here before we know it.
Yeah, fair point. Therefore, what I wish
snowing
for
in Oregon.
See, it's only like dusted once here in Maine. I just don't even understand.
So does anybody have any PRs or issues or stuff they want to talk about this week? I've been bad and I haven't put anything on the agenda. Go back.
It might be worth. I feel like I'm hearing a lot of questions about sort of how we tell if a registry has implemented OCI 1.1. I think you all have a issue on this. I don't know if this is I also didn't put it on the agenda until now.
I think it's 365, right?
Yeah. I'll add it.
Yeah, I know you were asking about some of this last time as well, Sajay, in terms of what to do on the ORAS and I'm assuming notation side as well.
Yeah, we have a bunch of places where we need to copy stuff around and client tooling specifically. So I think this was Shuei's team who kind of raised it on Slack.
Are you thinking of doing automatic transpiling at all on your side? Converting as you go from one registry to another?
I think my recommendation to the ORAS folks was don't change manifest types automatically. Just defeats the purpose of content addressability. So stick with one type, and portability between the two types are not something that we assume. For example, you don't convert between Docker and OCI automatically. I mean, you can, but you just don't. Because then the index and everything kind of like gets messed up also. The question was less about portability. It was whether from the registry we can deterministically decide what to use. For example, the use case right now is push and fail. It seems bad, right? You don't want to try pushing a manifest and then failing. The refers API doesn't deterministically tell you whether it's supported or not if the repository doesn't exist. You have to look at a substatus. So there's some holes in the discoverability of these capabilities. And I think initially we wanted to make sure that this was not a part of the working group, but being able to just define whether the registry supports a version was the ask. Whether it's referrers or any new API or the support of a new manifest, those kind of questions should not come from, I mean, yes, it can come from documentation, but do we want to do that? Because even
So you-
Kubernetes, you can query the version on the cluster and find out why can't you make runtimes do that smart thing.
You've got an assumption on your side that I don't make on my side, which is you say push and fail. You don't want to do that because it's a bad experience. From my side, I look at it and say, before I even try to push, I give it as the user option of user, what do you want to do? And if the user says, hey, I want to push with this manifest type, I'm not second guessing them. I'm not trying to auto upgrade or downgrade or anything like that. I'm just saying, whatever you give me, I'm going to do. And if the thing you gave me doesn't work, then it fails. And so I do look at the push and fail and just say, well, if it fails at that point. But it's because I've moved that decision back from an auto detecting what the registry has to the user must manually input that early on.
Okay.
That's kind of where I stopped as well. Like there's got to be a flag or something in the user experience. But I think the question is, should the clients have a way that they can determine, any workflow can determine this, irrespective of what the user gives? If you have a system, do you want the system to be able to tell its version, or do you want the system to have clients input what version that it wants to communicate to? I
I don't know if I want to trust the version.
Well,
and if a
trust
registry says, hey, I'm only a if a registry says, hey, I'm a V1.0 registry because they haven't done all the compliance stuff, they might still support the artifact manifest. They might just not support the refers API. And so how should
maybe
I-
two separate extensions?
Yeah, how should I adjust my behavior looking at something like that? I think last time we were talking about this, we were saying, hey, it needs to be like some kind of capabilities check, and they just come back with a whole bunch of capabilities. But I still look at it and say, if I'm getting to the point that I'm looking for a capability, then I just want to try that one API and see if it works. That's more useful to me than it is trying to query the registry on an API and then taking that assumption that whatever the registry comes back from their versioning API, their capabilities API, that's what it's really doing. Because the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try that API if it's supposed to be there. And if it's not there, then what do I do? I'm still going to have the error handling that I had before.
But this does make sense to me, what you're saying. Sort of like peek and poke kind of way of building clients is it works. I think when we get to having sort of abstractions and libraries and SDKs and other tooling that's bundled, I think having something that's a little more, I wouldn't say sophisticated, but just as a little more logically pokeable. I like that sort of analog of just saying, like, does it do this? Does it do that? Let me prove it. I think there's also value in version software. I mean, to say like, I don't trust a version, that's fine. I mean, a lot of my career has been built on trusting versions. So I'm kind of okay with that. And I think in this case, it is where we're stuck, where we could say, well, this is 1.0 until it's 1.1. So whether you implement parts of it or not is irrelevant. A client can say, no, it's 1.0, we're doing this other way. Now you have 1.1. Now we know you have artifacts and a refers API. Thanks. We could go with capabilities, right? And we've seen things like this through the years. You have a, sort of a bit mask or some JSON blob that lands and gives you strings of the things that it supports, whatever that is. Then you can actually kind of be more granular with it. I'm not sure I love that because it is a versioned API. There's no 1.1a and 1.1 final, right? I mean, we're just going to say there's 1.0 and there's 1.1, but we don't really even have that yet. And so there's really no way of knowing. And so you kind of poke at the refers API and say, okay, that exists. We assume that artifacts are there. We can't because it's in the spec. They're not tied, right? So I think that's the problem is, we could advise clients build this way of saying, well, try it. And if it fails, then respond. Something a little bit more refined might be nice.
I'll stop short of saying we don't have a version because we do have the conformance checks. And so if you pass all the conformance checks, you get whatever shiny badge that says, hey, this registry actually supports 1.1. it's not coming out of the registry itself. It's like a actual test, and then we record that as part of our part of the OCI conformance results. And
Yeah,
so
but there's no API to get that value, right?
there is not. And so that's
Right.
where I'm getting at is we've got this from the perspective of a user can look at a registry and see, is the registry I'm working with supporting this stuff, but we don't have something from the client and API level to be able to query this. And I'm hesitant to put too much value in there. I'm just going to pull another like example out there because I'm thinking of a whole lot of things can go wrong. One, I'll pull two examples out. One, you could have some kind of version API, and one person could take looking at the version and decide I'm going to push that refers, digest, and whatnot based off of that. And it decides, okay, well, I see that it's supposed to already have this refers API, so I'm not going to push that fallback tag. And you can have another tool that actually goes and does the poke and looks and sees, does the API actually respond? No, it doesn't respond. Let me manage that digest tag. You've got this thing now in two different states. You've got something that actually has the tag, something that doesn't have the tag. And depending on which of the different states the registry is in, you've got like 4 different possibilities there, I think, depending on where you are, because you have 2 variables at that point and 2 clients. So it can get in some very odd, inconsistent states that I get concerned of, and I kind of hesitate back from. And I'll hold off on my second example for Michael to jump in.
I think, like, I guess when you say that, my mind goes to sort of, isn't that what the specs are for? Like, if we're sort of saying we're not gonna, if a registry says they're 1.1 compliant, but then doesn't support that, like, why do clients need to necessarily care? Like, that's not compliant with the spec, and we would encourage people not to do it. But if someone is going to implement an OCI registry and not follow the spec, like, we shouldn't be designing tools around that possibility. And if we do, we end up with tools that have like all of this fallback and all of this extra code that checks conditions that shouldn't need to happen because people should implement against the spec. And yes, there will always be small pieces where things are maybe not implemented correctly, but
I wasn't going to go there.
Let's let the spec lead. And if we're not going to do that, then I don't know. Like, we just kind of go back to poking around.
Right now, what the spec says is that clients must actually hit the API, check the API, and that's how they decide their fallback. So we've got the definition in the spec right now of what to do.
But that's only for the refers API, right?
That's
just not for artifact spec.
It's not for the artifact manifest. So yeah, if you're asking, do they need to know if they can push the artifact manifest or not? Yeah, we don't have anything there because I've always delegated that as something that end users are probably going to need to step in at some point and make that decision as an input on their side. I'll throw the second example out, which is that you can throw out all the versioning and say, hey, we support version 1.1 of OCI or something. But I see Ram Kumar here, so I'll pick on Zot right now, which is that last check Zot doesn't support any of the Docker manifest. It supports all the OCI ones, but doesn't support the Docker ones. So if you try to push a Docker manifest to Zot right now, it'll say unknown manifest. And that's it's an unexpected behavior from anybody that's used to working with container images from the past, because I think probably 90% of our images are still probably all still out there at the Docker media types. So I'm always worried there's going to be an edge case out there where we can say, hey, you've got this version, and all of our checks say they're fine because they actually do support all the OCI specs. But then from the user standpoint, the user tries to use it, they'll hit these edges they just weren't expecting, just for weird issues. Go ahead, Jess.
Yeah, I guess I think this is one of the real values of something like this community, because when you're talking about a client, or you're talking about a use case, and I'm talking about one, they can be really different. And I think that's what makes a good specification. It's what makes a healthy community standard. I think from again, what you're saying totally makes sense. I don't want to repeat myself, but I think, for when we're building sort of automation behind managed services that are like these large at scale features that we want to implement, it becomes more difficult to say, let's sort of poke at this and we'll try a push. I mean, for example, OCI artifacts, determining whether a registry supports them. We could literally bundle one up, send it, look at the error code we get back, and now we're deterministically know, like, okay, that endpoint works or not. I don't want 500,000 clients doing that to me a minute. Like, that's kind of part of the thing here is I would much rather just return a value to a client and say, I support this, I don't support that. So I guess that's the question is A, do we as a community here think that that's needed, and B, how should we do it? Would it be capability strings? Would it be just a version, something, right? Because right now, I think you're right. Most stuff that has been introduced here has been an API endpoint. So you can just poke it. And if it doesn't exist, it doesn't exist. The OCI artifact this is a new thing, right? So I guess I'd like to understand that. Like, do we think this is a problem or not? And how would we like to address it?
So walk me down some of the scenarios where you think you're going to need that from a client standpoint, because I'll throw out the scenario that I'm thinking of, which is if I'm writing any software that's copying stuff back and forth or that's generating this stuff, if I'm copying it from one registry to another, it's either going to work or it's going to fail. And if it fails, it's because the registry doesn't support it. I throw the error back at the user and say, hey, the registry just doesn't support it. If I'm at the generating point where I'm creating these things, I'm pushing that decision back to the user, and the input that I'm going to give to the user is they can go and look at the OCI conforms, see if all their registries conform to OCI 1.1, and they'll know at that point, okay, it's safe for me to go ahead and start using this new spec, and I can start generating all my resources with that. So that pushes it back to a user thing. So I'm trying to work through what the workflow use case scenario is where we need something like this to be able to automatically detect it. Go ahead, Sajay.
I think we've stepped away from the OCI body being a standardizing or a list of all conformant registries kind of thing. We didn't want to kind of like aggregate all the media types and all that, right? So the conformance test is a good place, but I don't think expecting clients to depend on the conformance test to say whether a registry falls in a bucket of support is a model that I wasn't sure whether we wanted to align with that, because we stepped away from
clients, but end users inputting to clients.
Yes, but that's our body, right? Like in the sense that there are registries that don't register to the conformance suite also. Or do you expect them to run the conformance suite to find out? That would be another burden on them as well.
Yeah, either that or somebody the end user can run it. Hopefully the registry operator runs it. And I'd like to see the conformance be this little shiny badge of someone saying, hey, we actually support all this stuff. Look at us. We're number one. Go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, I think I don't, Sajay, I don't want to restate what you said. I think I agree with what you said. And if I'm saying a new thing, just tell me to shut up. But I feel like you and I are aligned here, thinking that like conformance and compliance are good, but maybe not the same as being able to determine if an API is versioned at a certain level or if capabilities are in place. I think use case wise, so one of the things that a lot of people are looking at this for right now is image signing. So I can give you a use case there, but it could be SBOMs, it could be attaching cat pictures to every image you push. It doesn't really matter, but something that a user can depend on either happening, right? Like as an automated feature of a service or with a simple client invocation without having to worry about the underlying details. I think that's where capabilities and versioning come in, right? I might have a user that doesn't even know they're talking to an OCI registry. They don't even think at that level. So the idea of saying, well, this is an OCI registry, and if I want to know if this is going to work, I need to assemble a certain type of artifact, and I will determine if that's the right artifact by looking at the OCI compliance logs and saying, okay, this one is 1.1, so now I can create an OCI artifact. I might build a tool where the customer doesn't even know that there's an OCI artifact being created. let alone if it's going to be pushed to an OCI registry. It might be, in other words, it might be in the context of an entirely different product that they're using. And ECR, in our case, is like an implementation detail, right? Or like parts of Azure Cloud could just be like implementation details of that. And so I think the idea of like surfacing the capabilities of the underlying implementation detail all the way up to the user isn't always the best experience, and maybe just wouldn't work. Now, it's absolutely valid for some client use cases, like you have pointed out. But I think building those sorts of managed solutions and using sort of OCI as an implementation detail it kind of demands that we get a little bit more provable in our capabilities.
So I'm trying to dig back to actual implementation and scenario kind of stuff. And so let me pick one out there right now, which was, I don't think we have anybody from Sigstore on here, so I'll just pick on Sigstore because they're nice. Right now, not to pick a fight, I figured they're the one independent one in the room because there's nobody here to represent them.
Yeah, I like that logic. That's fine.
Sigstore right now, as best I know, they're not pushing anything with the new artifact manifest. In fact, they held back by pushing something with a new content type because Docker Hub they were going to filter it out. And so they pushed that decision into their client product that said, hey, there are registries out there that don't support this stuff. So we're making the decision in our tooling itself that we're not going to push that new feature yet because we know that if we did, the user's going to have a bad experience down the road. And so does that make more sense in terms of, hey, that decision should be pushed into the tooling? Maybe there's a backward compatibility flag that you can pass on the command line, but it just defaults to trying to do the most compatible thing. And we're not trying to push that decision to be some kind of automatic upgrade in the tool. The tool just knows that, hey, registries out there are issues if I try to run into this. So I'm just going to fall back to the most compatible behavior out there. By doing that, by making that decision, the one thing that I really like about that is that content is now portable. Because I really hesitate. The fear that I get is if we ever try to make these decisions automatically is that we're going to make decisions, turn something into a resource that's not portable. You can't copy it around. And that's my big concern.
I'm going to just reply to that. Are my hands up?
Go
Then
for it.
my hands go down. Okay. I don't really follow that. So everything made sense to me there. Cosign as the client in Sigstore will do whatever it needs to. And that's kind of where it started, right? It was like, we don't have a standard. So we're just gonna do whatever we have to do to make this work. Completely support that. I think it was cool. And now we actually have an example of how to do this without support, but now we also have this new part of the standard that we can use. What I don't understand is in the working implementation, there is something there that isn't necessarily portable. It's something that the client needs to be aware of to make use of. Now it's portable in that I can pull it out of a registry and push it into another one, but it's meaningless without their interpretation. Whereas if we say, oh, this is 1.1, then we have OCI artifacts, that's a well-specified thing. I don't understand how that could potentially be less portable.
So the portability where I'm getting at is they're making decisions that they want to make sure this artifact they're creating could be pushed to Docker hubs. They made decisions on configuration media type where they're just going to imply that they were a regular image, even though they weren't. So they made decisions on how they did it to push something that was portable, that could work on any registry out there. And so they didn't make a runtime decision in this. They didn't query the registry to see, does this registry support the different media type? Oh, it does. I'm going to change that media type and put a Sigstore media type versus the generic image media type, depending on which registry I'm talking to. They made that decision in advance, compiled it into the code so that they had something that could work anywhere.
Yep. I mean, I understand that, completely get that. I don't understand how adding sort of versioning or capabilities reporting from a registry endpoint can risk somebody not being able to do that in the future. But furthermore, I would think that if OCI 1.0 included references and artifacts, they would have just used them. I would also think that. Like, I think that's a bit of a finding proof.
I don't think they would use it if they run into registries didn't support it.
Well, I mean,
Right
so
now-
what,
Right now, 99% of the registries don't support
Fair.
the refers API. So they wouldn't have used that just because they know that they were trying to get that usability out there.
what I meant was if it was everywhere, right? If Docker Hub 8-9 years ago had refers and artifacts,
Yeah.
and that landed in OCI 1.0, right?
Yeah. If it was ubiquitous, I think
That's what I'm
we
saying.
wouldn't be having this conversation.
Yeah,
My fear is this in between time where you're going to have 2 or 3 registries that support it and a dozen that don't. And if we start making runtime decisions and saying, hey, I happen to be pushing to a registry it does support today, now you're creating an object that can't be copied to 80% of the registries out there.
Yep. Yeah,
That's my fear.
I'll Sajay's hands up. I suck at the hand thing. I'm sorry, you guys.
Me too.
I just wanted to kind of like bring it back to the original discussion. From a future standpoint, do we want clients to have this capability to determine is what the discussion is? Sigstore was the forcing function for the working group. So they didn't like the solution. So there's clear indication that the solution that existed was not what they wanted, right? So given that premise of why the working group was formed, should this group define a way to determine the version, I think is the primary question here. The in-between state I recognize is a hard one, right? But we want to move to the better place where tags are not the source of binding signed artifacts and SBOMs and whatnot. So with that forward moving decision, do we want to provide this capability is what I would like to get this community to focus on. For example, OCI itself is not majorly adopted, to be honest, right? If we say that Docker Hub is the majority of chunk, pushing OCI artifacts to Docker Hub is a secondary solution, like the Scopio and Podman and different efforts that happen. So do we want to make sure that this new API is complete in some form for the next version of 1.1 is the primary question here. I totally acknowledge that the in-between solution is probably a little confusing, but what's the forward direction is what I would like us to focus on if possible.
I think where I'm going with that is there a use case out there we can come up with where we need this that doesn't involve creating something that's not portable?
I mean,
Sorry, clarify, I didn't follow that.
yeah,
Like, is there a use case where you need this API, the capabilities API, to be able to query a registry? Is there a need for that doesn't involve creating an object that isn't portable to registries that don't have the capability?
but isn't that like a thing already? Like,
Why is
if-
portability important for this? That's my question. Like I understand why it's important in some cases, but why is it important?
To me,
Always.
thinking of the end user scenario, if we create something that's not portable based off of what the registry does, now we create upgrade issues. Say I'm creating a CI/CD pipeline, I push to an internal registry in the company, and then that gets copied out to an external publicly facing registry later on. If I test my upgrade on the internal registry first, I just broke my whole CI/CD pipeline because now all the objects I create can't be pushed out to the production server. So,
But in a lot of cases, that doesn't matter. Like I would say most images that are created are not copied between registries, or they're copied between registries of the same type. And so if there's a huge use case of people who are just signing their own images, they're going to push them to their own registry that don't care that they're portable at all.
I feel like a big chunk of what we were trying to do in the working group was make things work portable, but Jesse beat me to the hand. Go ahead, Jesse.
Okay.
oh, Michael, if you have more to say, go for it. I mean, I'm just
No, go for it.
I think, yeah, I mean, I think this gets back. No, I think we all want portability, so that I will not argue with that. Like, yes, there's a goal of portability. I think where I'm getting hung up here is functionally, we can have code that needs to know if it can create an artifact and push it, and if there's a refers API, right? So we can ping for the refers API, and if it's there or not, we know. and we check a box, and then we can assemble an artifact and push it. And if it fails with a particular error code, we know that it's not supported. And if it succeeds, then we know it's supported. Now we check that box. So now we know these two things. And then we can carry on with our program logic, in the client from there. I think all I would like to see is for us to have an ability to either check an API version or to retrieve a capabilities blob to tell me that those things are there or not. And then I can implement that a little cleaner, ideally without any user interaction. And hey, Jason, and I guess like a follow on to that is portability wise. And I think you just nailed it in your CI/CD example. There's nothing that makes a 1.1 OCI artifact portable to an OCI 1.0 registry that doesn't support it yet. Right. So there's nothing in tooling or in API pinging or checking or any of this stuff that would change that. Right. Like if, for example, the foo registry out there in the world, which doesn't exist, I hope, is 1.0 forever because they just want to be there. And I create an artifact in ECR and I pull it with Scopio and I want to push it over there, it'll fail. That's the way it is, right? I mean, they don't yet support 1.1. So I'm not sure how I wouldn't categorize that as non-portable. I guess that was the thing I was hung up on before too.
And I would also say like it is still portable. What's important is like what it wraps. It's not the manifest itself. And so if you have a signature that's wrapped in an artifact manifest and pushed to a registry that supports artifacts, and you want to copy that to a registry that has not yet supported the new artifact manifest, you can convert that. And yes, it changes the digest, but the important parts of it, what is already, cryptographically sound, can be ported between registries and work with, whatever tool that you have to verify it just as well as it did before.
I feel like all eyes are probably staring on me on that one. Because I just keep going back to the same scenario for me is the tooling at runtime. If you're creating something, you're changing what you're doing, you can only make that decision based off the one registry you're talking to. And you don't have the visibility the user has that's running your tool that knows where that resource might be pushed to later on. And so I just end up pushing it back to that for anything I'm writing. I push it back to the user itself that's generating it rather than trying to have the tool do a runtime decision. That's where I keep saying, let's give me a use case that doesn't involve something like that. Give me a use case where, it actually does need to be happening at the tool and not at the user level.
I think that statement this should have a disclaimer. The user should know where their content goes. Otherwise you have redistribution issues and all that stuff. So I think it's fair to assume that, yes, the user produces an artifact and they know the targets where the content is going is a fair statement. But either way, I would like people to maybe comment on the issue because there's no indication of who wants that issue supported or not. And what's the path forward is still not clear. Like, should we make a proposal? Should we not implement that API, or that's still not coming out from that issue? Just from a process standpoint, it's still a little gray. Jason, go ahead.
You're at the risk of just disagreeing with everything everyone says. Your example of the artifact producer should know where it's going to end up getting published to. I can imagine somebody like Prometheus builds a Prometheus image and distributes it via YAML or a Helm chart or something with the idea that it is supposed to be sort of pulled into your registry when you install it and pulled into whatever other registry when you install it over here. And that's sort of, some projects do this today where like they produce something somewhere in one registry, but then the installation process actually puts it into your registry, and that's outside of their, control. Right now, we only have one, like there is no there is very minimal compatibility worries, so that when Prometheus does that, they don't have to worry about every registry supporting it. But like, if we're going to introduce one of those, I wouldn't want to put it back onto Prometheus and every project to distribute a OCI 1.0 version of their artifacts and OCI 1.1 version of their artifacts and make users care about all of that. Does that example make any sense? Am I just completely crazy?
I'm going to unmute without a hand and say, yes, it made total sense. But I will also say, anybody who disagrees, please raise your hand, because I think we'd all agree with that. Like, nobody, I don't think anybody wants people building versioned artifacts.
Well, yeah, where the version is because of our mistake.
Right.
Yeah.
No, exactly. Yeah, I don't think anybody wants that. Now you've got a hand. See, Brendan, back to you.
I had to take my hand down because you're like, if anybody disagrees, raise your hand. And I was like, crap, my hand's up. Yeah, from my standpoint, I'm thinking along the lines of, if I was building a Helm chart, I keep saying end user, and end user might not be whoever random person is trying to run their application. It's probably someone that's making the tooling that user is using to build their stuff. And so that if your tooling is, say, I want to build a Helm chart, the tooling out there might make the decision for the user that we're going to make these Helm charts in a way that's very compatible to go across a lot of places, because we don't want users to report back they're having issues building and pushing Helm charts to their registry. And so it's a question of portability for them. They want to make sure that they stay in a very portable state for a longer period of time until they feel comfortable making that switch in the tooling.
Yeah, Tianan's example in the chat is also good, that gzip and Z standard compression is a similar thing. I think that's a good analog. I missed the first half hour of this, and I apologize if what I'm about to say has already been beaten to death, but for what it's worth, I agree with Brandon. I will put it in the issue as well on the record, but I agree with Brandon that I think it's better to have capability checking be done via an actual call to the actual API, rather than have a capability endpoint that tells you that the next API call should succeed, and then if it doesn't, what do you do? Like, now we have two sources of truth on it, and one is more source of truthy than the other one, so why have the other one in the first place? But
You've also kind of got like
this has already
two
been
error
beat.
handlers.
Yeah.
Two error handlers for the exact same error, depending on how they get to that path. What I'll say that we kind of went into, so maybe taking what Jesse is about to say here, was that works good for an API. It doesn't work if you're trying to figure out a supported manifest type. And so the question that has been raised is, do they want to have the ability for tooling to automatically upgrade to a different manifest type, from pushing an image spec artifact to pushing an artifact manifest directly based off of whatever their registry currently supports. And that was where I threw out the scenario that what one registry supports might not be what the other registries support that you're going to push this to later on. That was my fear. And so we went back and forth on that a little bit.
Totally agree with that. The only caveat is I trust versioning. I mean, like if a registry says it's 1.0, then I'm not going to assume that it supports OCI artifacts. And if it says it's 1.1, I'm going to assume that it does support OCI artifacts. And then my code will be defensive enough to know that it might still fail and I have to error handle it. That's fine. But I mean, that's the problem. It's not whether or not an API exists, which I also have a problem with, but that's just because I'm an old OS graybeard and I think everything should be versioned, whatever. I like to wrap things, right? If I wrap an SDK around this thing, can I abstract it from the user? And what you're saying is no. The user has to be somewhat aware of what my underlying implementation is. I don't love that.
So they need to be aware. And again, the user might not be end user building the Helm chart. That's going to be potentially the user writing the software that builds Helm charts, or that packages Helm charts. You know, it's not the person writing their individual Helm chart. So whoever's making that decision is going to be looking at it from a high level of saying, look, 70% of registries support this, 30% don't. Let me go ahead and take the conservative view that I'm just going to find the thing that 95% of registries support for right now, because I don't want all those open issues on my repo. And so they would push that decision back on their side just because they want that there. I still think you've got a workflow for not making a decision on whether it's an artifact or an image, but whether you're going to use the refers or the fallback API over there on the refers API stuff to fall back to the tag. That still exists. We still have that workflow. So depending on which of these two conversations we're having, I think we've got the fallback as you're looking at supported APIs on the registry, but we don't have the automatic fallback for the media type itself, just because, you know, the concern for me is that you just don't know where that's going to get moved to later on.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks. I think I was mostly thinking of that question in terms of the refers API, which is a much easier one to handle than the media type question.
So are we comfortable saying that if referrers is not supported, OCI manifest is not supported? Artifact manifest is not supported?
I get the
I don't
feeling
think-
registries are going to implement these independently.
Yeah, I think they
We should call that out. That's what I'm saying. If we should clearly say that if referrers is not supported, OCI artifact manifest is not supported. They're not tied right now in any place.
Outside of this, I think if you pass the conformance test for 1.1, you're going to have both, but that's outside of whatever we're looking at right here. So there's still a carrot at the end of this. I don't want to say there's a stick. We'll only use carrots for our stuff. That registries are going to want to support both, but timing wise, I don't think we have control of saying a registry is going to implement this feature before the other feature.
You know what, for the record, just because I have to say it, because we've said compliance about 18,000 times in this call, ECR will support both of these. We're not going to be compliant anytime soon. So I have some PRs to file. We have maybe a couple nits to fix, but I don't see these being related. Just going to say it.
What do you mean that you won't be compliant? Like you'll be implementing the APIs as described. Is that not?
We'll
Yeah,
be compliant
totally
with
do that.
this, but we
Yeah.
already have things that are not compliant, and
Yeah.
we're
There are
not
certain
going to
things, there are certain design
block
decisions that
launching the
we've
refers
made.
API on fixing all of those other things.
Gotcha.
Exactly.
Okay, sorry. I thought you meant you were going to implement this, but not compliantly. And I was like, but
Yeah.
why? it's the old one.
No, that is not at all. Yeah, no, like we support image manifests. Hey, how you doing? We're not OCI compliant.
I don't really think
That's my-
JSON is the right way to return a response.
I have some issues with the HTTP codes. No, there's a couple of things that are completely unrelated to the mainstream way that most of our users use the registry that, you know, and make us not check the box on compliance. We will fully support this in a compliant manner. That's my point, is that we can't say, oh, does that thing, I mean, effectively Docker Hub and ECR are just not registries you can ever use because neither of them are compliant, right? That's not a thing, right? So that's my point. And compliance is important. I am a big fan of compliance, especially for OCI. I'm just saying it can't be the way we know that something is supported or not.
Yeah, I guess to remove the C word from the sentence though, Sajay's question was should a user who can reach the refers API successfully use that as a signal that they
Assume
can
that,
also make an artifact manifest happen?
That's
And,
exactly right. Yeah.
What is everyone's answer to that on 3?
Well, just to be clear, like that was the first question. That was the question we were trying to answer.
I was just trying to trick everyone into answering definitively so that we could
You can't.
go
One's
home.
in the image spec, the other's in the distribution
Yeah,
spec. You
yeah.
can't.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Okay. I'll also raise my hand. I don't care. So what I'm hearing from this is that we don't actually have a decision, but it feels like the opinion, and I know we're going over now, it feels like the opinion is such that client software should basically poke at things, and if they don't fail, then they can move on and use them. and that we're not thinking that either a version string on an API endpoint or a capabilities API endpoint is something that we want to pursue.
For APIs, yes. For media types, I think I'm still holding back and saying let's try to push that into more of a hard code in the tooling and put flags in there to avoid using features before people are ready for it state. But I am willing to entertain that we might need a capabilities API if we can find a good use case there. I don't have it yet. I'm still looking for what that use case is.
Brandon, I support you for making sure that tooling needs the flag, because I don't want, honestly, I'm not a supporter of automatic conversion, but I want to fail fast. Today, I can't fail fast in the tooling, even to kind of like quickly determine without making a call to referrers, checking substatus, pushing the OCI manifest. There's a bunch of places where we need to do this. And people who have written this code are the people who actually said, like, we cannot fail fast, cannot deterministically fail fast also, because the referrers can be behind authentication. So you want to get 200 back, right? That's what we said. But now the OCI manifest might or might not get supported because it's in a different specification. So just making sure that we can fail fast. Okay, let's take your example of client is saying, I want to put a new manifest type, that they're forcing it. That's the model that they're choosing. The client cannot deterministically even go through that flow because the manifest put might succeed and referrers might fail, or the referrers will succeed and the manifest put might fail. So there's still a bunch of error handling that they have to do anyway. So I think the ask is, can we fail fast when we know that the client is determined to use this new flow? And how do we tell the client saying that, okay, check the referrers. If the referrers doesn't exist, don't do this, right? Or the referrers will return a substatus that says, okay, my repository doesn't exist, but I do support the referrers, or something like that. That portion of the spec is a little gray. So it's not about conversion that I'm going after. I'm clearly going after, let's fail fast. And the spec should allow us to fail fast.
That's probably the best explanation or a scenario that I can think of that I've heard so far. So that one I can buy. And I would say the rephrasing it, if I heard it right, is before you start pushing blobs, before you start doing authentication, you want to know if you can even push this object to the registry before doing that stuff. And so,
correct, because clients are going to create this manifest on disk, right? So now what's happening is that you're creating this new stuff because you've said you want all this. You've done the workflow, you put the signature, done the JSON, logged the JSON. There's a bunch of logging that happens under the covers, and then you're like trying to push it, and like boom, it just fails. So I think just being able to fail fast, saying that okay, this registry doesn't support is the value add here. I think we've kind of lost the discussion of whether we want a capabilities API or not, but just focusing on the use case of how can we deterministically say that this new stuff is not supported is the ask here.
that one, if we haven't put it already, probably make sense to throw that in the issue. That you want to, before you push the blob, you want to know if the manifest push will work.
I think that's what the issue is. I mean, I'm sorry, that's what I was trying to relate before. And thank you, Sajay, for putting it into better words. Like, basically, I want to be able to write code that can determine if something will fail rather than trying and failing and responding to it. That's all. I'm literally 20 minutes late for another meeting. So that's how much I love you all, but I need to grab at least 10 minutes of it. So I will see you next time. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Please comment on the issue because there's no history of this call unless somebody goes and looks at this call, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good call out. I should comment too.
So otherwise you're stuck with my comment, and I'm very wordy and I say things and people tend to nod along with me. So
Is there anything else we wanted to discuss? I'm also happy to leave early if there's nothing else on the docket.
We start with nothing at all on the docket. I'm sure there's stuff I'm forgetting about, but I can't think of it right now. I know I've got a lot of stuff sitting in the queue. We do have the election going on now. So anybody's maintaining stuff, make sure you vote. Yeah, we all love the XML manifest type. When they say someone's going to push it, just annoy registries, just see what happens. All right, I did not hear anybody else chiming in on topics they want. And I am blanking on anything else I was thinking about adding. So give you back 5-10 minutes of your day.
Cool. See you folks.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a great one. Thanks, everybody.